The Sicilian defense begins e4, c5. The open Sicilian continues with knight to f3, d6, and d4. So white trades this valuable center pawn for black's flank pawn in order to open up the game and get clear diagonals for his bishops and play in an open tactical fashion. Black trades pawns, and now he normally plays knight to f6 in this position. He can play other moves, but the purpose of knight to f6 is to attack the e4 pawn and induce white to play the very natural knight to c3 to guard it. If black plays something else, like g6, that gives white another option. He can play c4 and get a strong grip on the d5 square. So knight to f6 limits white's options in this position, so white usually responds with knight to c3 to guard the pawn. Now if black plays the move g6 here, this is known as the dragon variation. It may get its name from this pawn formation, which may have reminded somebody of a dragon, or maybe it's just called the dragon variation because it's so fierce and counterattacking and difficult to deal with. The dragon variation is very natural. Black developed in the most logical way. He had these pawns on these dark squares, so he wanted to fianchetto his kingside bishop. He'll castle kingside, he'll get this knight to c6, he'll develop this bishop somewhere on this diagonal, he'll put a rook on c8. It's all very natural. We're going to take a look at 4 different responses that white can make in this position, 4 of the most popular responses. We're going to start with the most popular of all, called the Yugoslav Attack. So let's review the dragon moves: e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4 is the open Sicilian, allowing the trade of pawns, knight to f6 attacking e4, inducing white to block his own c-pawn with knight to c3, and then g6 is the most natural move here. That's the dragon move to get this bishop developed on g7. Okay, one plan for white in this position is to hurry up and develop his queenside pieces and castle on the queen side. To do this, he can play the move bishop to e3. So already that's a signal to black that white probably intends to castle queenside. Black will usually follow up with the move bishop to g7 as intended. I want to point out that it's a mistake to try to attack the bishop on e3, even though the knight is currently guarded here, because white has the tactic bishop to b5 check. And there are a few ways to guard against the check, but they all lose material. For example, bishop to d7 allows the knight to be taken immediately because this bishop is pinned and cannot take the queen. Or knight to d7 blocks the bishop and we get the knight for free. And finally, knight to c6 allows a trade to occur on c6 followed by a fork, and white wins the exchange on a8. So black cannot attack that bishop on e3 in this position with knight to g4. So he follows up with his intended move bishop to g7. And now white would like to play his queen to d2 to get ready to castle. But if he moves it to d2 here, that would allow black to play the harassing move knight to g4 because the queen would no longer be on that square. So white prepares the move queen to d2 by first playing the move f3. So that keeps the knight off of the g4 square and allows the move queen to d2 to happen. It also supports the e4 pawn in the center. Okay, black will follow up by castling kingside, and then queen to d2 as intended. Knight to c6 is a normal developing move, putting pressure on the d4 knight. Now before castling queenside, a useful move in this position is bishop to c4. The purpose of that is to stop the pawn advance d5, attacking white's strong center pawn. So white takes control of the d5 square first before castling. Black will normally play bishop to d7, developing the bishop modestly, but vacating the c8 square for a rook. Then white follows up by castling. So this is called the Yugoslav attack. Notice the name has the word attack in it. It's because white has castled on the opposite side from black, and so he intends to attack the black king. Here's how he's going to do it. His main weapon is pushing the h-pawn and trying to pry open the h-file. If he plays h4 and black responds with h5 to block that, he always has the move g4 to remove the h5 pawn and then continue pushing the h-pawn. So white is going to attempt to open the h-file and attack that way. He's also going to try to get rid of black's defending minor pieces here. One way to do that is to play bishop to h6, which is another reason why the queen is on d2, to support bishop to h6 to trade these dark squared bishops. And to get rid of this knight, he could do that in a couple ways. He could play g4 followed by g5 to kick the knight away, especially if the knight doesn't have the option of playing knight to h5 blocking the h-file. Or white can sometimes play knight to d5 to attack the knight that way. Okay, meanwhile, black is going to try to attack white on the queen side. So it's a mutually attacking position. And he can do that with moves such as knight to e5, attacking the c4 bishop. He can play queen to a5 at some point, rook to c8. He can play the move b5 if it's supported, maybe a6 first, and start attacking on the queen side. In fact, when the rook comes to c8 and some of these pieces clear the file, sometimes the move rook takes c3. The knight on c3 is played in order to break apart the pawn structure on the queen side here and further attack the king. So it's a pretty violent variation of the dragon defense. Both sides are trying for a quick win, and it takes a lot of study to play it well. But let's look at another way to play the dragon. It's called a classical variation. So let's review. Sicilian. d4 is the open Sicilian. Pawns get traded. Knight to f6, knight to c3. g6 signals the dragon variation. So a simpler, more modest way for white to play is to castle kingside. And he can do that by playing bishop to e2 in this position. And this is called the classical variation once white develops his bishop to e2. So he's signaling a quieter, more positional game. He's going to castle kingside. The bishop is well placed here. Both the queen and the bishop are guarding the g4 square in case a knight wanted to hop in there, which allows the move bishop to e3 to occur without it getting harassed. Okay, bishop to g7 is the usual follow-up. Castles, knight to c6, normal developing move. This puts pressure on the knight on d4. It's under pressure not only by that knight, but also by this bishop, this dragon bishop here. If this knight moves out of the way, then there's some tactics possible here. For example, white needs to think about the move knight takes e4 in this position, unleashing the bishop on the d4 knight. So because of that, white would be advised to play bishop to e3 in this position, further supporting the d4 knight. And notice the bishop on e3 can't be kicked away or traded off with knight to g4 because this bishop is nicely placed to stop that from happening. So black can castle. And here, the d5 square becomes important. Black would like to push his pawn to d5 and attack white's strong e-pawn and free his game. So a good move in this position for white is knight to b3, which unleashes the queen's protection of the d5 square and now makes that pawn push impossible in this position because we have that square guarded 3 times here. Also, white is preserving pieces instead of trading them off. Now, bishop to e6 is the most popular move in the position at that point. Looks kind of strange to block in the e-pawn, but black doesn't need to push the e-pawn to get his development going. The bishop is well placed here, influencing all these squares, including the important d5 square. All right, so that's a normal position in the classical variation. Let's turn to something called the Levenfish attack. Okay, so here, again, review the Sicilian, the open Sicilian, pawns get traded, black attacks e4, which induces white to play knight c3 to block his c-pawn, and then g6, the dragon move. Okay, an excellent move here for club players, for amateurs, I think is the move f4, called the Levenfish Attack. There are a lot of traps in this opening. It's very difficult for black to respond to this on the spur of the moment if he doesn't have anything prepared for it. If white knows this really well, he can overrun black's position. And this is not the most popular move in the dragon. It's probably the 4th or 5th most popular move in the dragon, so it has that going for it as well. It's sort of a surprise. Not many players prepare for it. It's very aggressive, and there are a lot of traps. So consider playing it. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all the theory and the traps in this introductory video, but I'll show you the main way that black proceeds in order to avoid all of the headaches. So this is the main line of the Levenfish attack. Okay, before I show you black's move, I'll begin by saying white intends to push e5 in this position. That's one of the reasons for the move f4, to support that push and simultaneously attack d6 and f6. So black's best move turns out to be knight to c6 to put pressure or to put defense on that e5 square. So before pushing to e5 in this position, white will normally trade knights first, removing the defender of the e5 square. Then he'll push e5. Now black doesn't want to take that pawn, leave himself with an isolated pawn, get his king stuck in the center. It just doesn't look so good. So black is going to normally continue with knight to d7, blocking the connection between the queens here. Then white trades pawns, and we get to a slightly quieter position now that the e-pawn has traded for the d-pawn. So that's the best defensive technique black has against the Levenfish. There's a lot of theory, a lot of things to study if you want to play that. And finally, we'll look at one more variation in the dragon called the Fianchetto Variation. So again, starting over, reviewing, e4, c5 is the Sicilian, knight f3, d6, remember, is designed to stop the pawn push e5, d4, the open Sicilian, trading pawns, knight f6, attacking e4, knight c3, guarding it, blocking the c-pawn, and g6 is the dragon move. So the fourth variation we're going to look at here is called the Fianchetto Variation, which is the move g3, which is a very strange looking move. White uses another important tempo in the opening to fianchetto his bishop, which already had an open diagonal. So it looks kind of strange, but there is a point to it. It's subtle, it's positional. Just like the classical variation. It's a little quieter. It's not an all-out attack like the Yugoslav or the Levenfish. Okay, knight to c6 is a normal developing move here. Bishop to g7 would have been just fine as well. But knight to c6, it does attack this knight in the center and threatens to take it and draw the queen out a little early into the center of the board where it can face some pressure by the dragon bishop. So white players will normally retreat that knight to e2. It's very safe and comfortable on e2. It's not blocking the bishop, which is going to fianchetto anyway. And from e2, it does influence these important squares on d4 and f4. White also avoids the trade of pieces. Bishop g7 follows. Bishop g2 as intended. Castles, castles. And one point of this fianchetto variation is to overprotect that e4 pawn. So now that the bishop is protecting it, that frees up this knight to move. So it often moves to d5 into an aggressive post. And if black kicks it away with e6, then it's going to retreat, and white argues that the d6 pawn becomes a bit weaker after the move e6 and becomes an attacking point. If knight to d5 is exchanged off with knight takes d5, then white's normally going to recapture with his e pawn and then utilize the half-open e file. So it's a slow positional maneuvering type of game. Grandmasters don't think that the Fianchetto variation or the classical variation are really strong attempts to gain an opening advantage against the dragon. The Yugoslav is considered the most promising way to get that opening advantage, but not everybody wants to play the Yugoslav attack. It's very quick. It's almost like gambling from the amateur's point of view, because you don't really know who is going to break through first. Is white going to break through on the king side in this Yugoslav, or is black going to break through on the queen side? So amateurs don't play perfectly, and it's fun and exciting, but it's not for everybody. Some people do like to play slower and more positionally, as in the classical variation or the Fianchetto variation. I don't think grandmasters consider the Levenfish attack as very dangerous for black either, now that black has worked out this way of responding to it. But as I said earlier, it's a strong attacking weapon for an amateur, because not a lot of black players are going to know it very well. It's not the most common way to play the dragon, and there are a lot of traps. So give it a try. That's my recommendation. Play the Levenfish. All right, thanks for watching this introductory video.